Picture this. It's 1989. New York City is the most dangerous city in America. Murders, rapes, robberies. The streets are bleeding and the newspapers are screaming for justice. And tonight, the police have 5 suspects in custody, 5 teenagers, Black and Latino kids from Harlem. The youngest is 14 years old. And here's the thing that makes this case impossible to ignore. Every single one of them confessed. On camera, on tape. Looking straight into the lens, they said they did it. So why, 13 years later, were all 5 convictions thrown out? Why did a completely different man come forward and say he was the one who did it? And why did his DNA match while theirs never did? Stay with me. Because this story isn't just about 5 kids who got railroaded. This is about how a confession, the thing we trust most in a courtroom, can be the biggest lie in the room. Part 1. The city, the night, the victim. To understand this case, you have to understand what New York City felt like in 1989. It wasn't the glossy, tourist-friendly Manhattan you might know today. In 1989, New York had over 1,300 murders in a single year. Central Park, that same park where couples now picnic and kids ride bikes, was a place people genuinely feared after dark. So on the night of April 19, 1989, when around 30 teenagers from Harlem gathered and entered Central Park, some of them started attacking strangers, joggers, cyclists, random passers-by. It was reckless, dangerous, and terrifying for the victims. But in the chaos of that night, something far worse happened deeper in the park. Trisha Mealy, 28 years old, a white investment banker, went jogging alone. It was around 9 p.m. She didn't come home. At around 1:30 in the morning, police found her in a ravine, partially clothed. She had been beaten so savagely her skull was fractured. Her body temperature had dropped to 84 degrees Fahrenheit. She had lost 75% of her blood. She was alive, barely. She spent nearly 2 weeks in a coma. And when she finally woke up, she remembered nothing. Not a face, not a voice, not a single detail about her attacker. The trauma had wiped the night completely clean from her memory. The police had no eyewitness, no description, no suspect. What they did have was a city that was furious, and 5 teenagers already in custody for the other disturbances in the park that night. And that's where the real story begins. Part 2. The 5 teenagers. Let me introduce you to 5 people whose lives were about to be destroyed. Antron McCrae, 15 years old. Kevin Richardson, 14 years old, the youngest. Yusuf Salam, 15 years old. Raymond Santana, 14 years old. Corey Wise, 16 years old, the oldest of the group, and because of that single fact, the one who would suffer the most. None of them were close friends. They were all just part of the larger group in the park that night. Some of them barely knew each other's names. Yes, some of them had participated in the earlier harassment and attacks on joggers. That's true, and it's important to say it. They weren't angels that night, but participating in a gang assault on a jogger and brutally raping and nearly beating a woman to death, those are 2 completely different crimes. And here's what the physical evidence would eventually scream from the rooftops. Not one of these 5 boys had anything to do with what happened to Trisha Mealy. But the police didn't know that yet. Or maybe, and this is the disturbing part, they didn't want to know. Because they already had their suspects. They already had 5 names, and now all they needed were confessions. Part 3. The interrogation rooms, where truth goes to die now. Here's where I need you to really pay attention, because what happened next is the psychological engine of this entire story. The 5 boys were taken to different police precincts and interrogated separately. They couldn't talk to each other. They couldn't compare stories. And most of them couldn't even talk to a lawyer, because in 1989, the rules around juvenile interrogations were, let's say, flexible. The interrogations lasted between 14 and 30 hours. Think about that. 14 to 30 hours. No sleep. Minimal food or water. In a cold, hard room. With detectives, grown men, taking shifts so they stayed fresh while the teenagers got more exhausted and more terrified by the hour. And the detectives didn't just sit there quietly. They used every psychological weapon in the book. They lied. They told each boy that the others had already confessed and named him as the ringleader. Your friend already told us everything. He said it was your idea. You're the one who's going to take the fall here, unless you start talking. That's not speculation. That's a documented interrogation tactic called the Reed technique. And in America, it is completely legal for police to lie to suspects during questioning. They told the boys that their fingerprints were at the scene. Lie. They told them that physical evidence already proved their guilt. Lie. They implied that if the boys just cooperated, if they just admitted some small involvement, they could go home. Just tell us what happened and this will all be over. And here's the thing about being 14 years old. Exhausted, terrified, and alone in a room with authority figures who are telling you that you are already guilty, and your only choice is between going home tonight or spending the rest of your life in prison. Your brain does something that seems irrational to everyone watching from the outside. It starts to believe them. One by one, 4 of the 5 boys broke. Antron McCrae, Kevin Richardson, Raymond Santana, and Corey Wise gave videotaped confessions. Yusuf Salam made oral statements, and every single one of them immediately recanted the moment they got proper legal representation. Every one of them said the same thing. I didn't do it. They made me say it. But by then, the cameras had the tape, and in America's courtrooms, a confession on tape is almost impossible to overcome. Almost. Part 4. The confessions that didn't add up. Now here's where this story transforms from a tragedy into something that should make every single one of us deeply, profoundly unsettled. Because if you actually look at those confessions, not the headlines, not the sound bites, but the actual content of what these 5 boys said on tape, they don't make sense. The 4 video confessions contradicted each other. They disagreed on the time of the attack. They disagreed on the location within the park. They disagreed on how many people were involved. They disagreed on the sequence of events. 4 people supposedly describing the same crime they all participated in together, and they couldn't agree on a single major detail. You know why? Because they weren't there. They were making it up as they went, repeating suggestions that detectives had fed them, mixed with desperate guesses. But it gets worse. Not one of the boys admitted to actually penetrating the victim. Think about what that means. If 5 people gang raped someone, every single one of them would know whether they had personally committed that act. The fact that none of them would say they did? That's not a coincidence. That's because they didn't. And the timelines? The confessions placed the attack at times that were flatly contradicted by credible witness statements. At the times the boys said the rape was happening, other people who were in the park placed some of the boys in completely different locations. But here's the thing that should have stopped this case cold. The DNA. Investigators collected semen evidence from the victim and from a sock found at the crime scene. In 1989, DNA testing was relatively new, but it existed. And they tested all 5 boys. Every single one was excluded. Not one of them matched, not even a partial match. The semen at the crime scene belonged to an unidentified male, someone who wasn't in that interrogation room, someone who wasn't on trial. The FBI confirmed it. The science was clear. Research in criminal psychology tells us something chilling. Confession evidence is so powerful that juries will convict, even when it contradicts all other evidence. It doesn't feel like it should be true, but study after study confirms it. When someone says, "I did it," something in the human brain locks on. It overrides everything else. And it wasn't just the courtroom working against these boys. Outside those walls, The media had whipped the city into a frenzy. That man was Donald Trump. By the time juries deliberated, these boys had already been convicted in the court of public opinion. The verdict came back guilty across the board. Antron McCrae, Raymond Santana, Kevin Richardson, and Yusuf Salam were sentenced to juvenile detention. They were teenagers, so they couldn't receive the harshest adult sentences. But Corey Wise was 16, legally old enough to be tried and sentenced as an adult. Part 6. The Real Predator. Matias Reyes. His name was Matias Reyes. In 1989 alone, the same year as the Central Park attack, Reyes committed a series of brutal rapes in the same area of New York City using the same method. He targeted women who were alone. He was violent. He was brazen. He raped and murdered a pregnant woman just days after the Central Park attack. And here's the part that will keep you up at night. One of his 1989 victims described her attacker in detail, including that he had fresh stitches on his chin. A police investigator actually connected this description to Reyes. His name was already in the system. But no one linked him to the Central Park jogger case, because that case was already solved. 5 confessions were already on tape. Why would anyone keep looking? Reyes was eventually caught in 1991 for his other crimes and sentenced to life in prison. He sat behind bars. The exonerated 5 sat behind bars. For years, nothing. Then in 2001, something happened inside a prison that would crack the case open. Corey Wise, still serving his sentence after more than a decade, crossed paths with Matias Reyes inside the prison system. Reyes later said that seeing Corey Wise, knowing that this man had lost years of his life for something he, Reyes, had done alone, began to haunt him. In 2002, Matias Reyes approached prison authorities and confessed. Voluntarily, unprompted. With no legal benefit to himself, his confession didn't reduce his sentence by a single day. He described the attack in detail. He described the location. He described what he did. He described details that had never been made public, details only the actual perpetrator could know. And then investigators ran his DNA against the biological evidence that had been sitting in storage for 13 years. It matched. Every marker. He had acted alone. The 5 boys had never been there. In 2014, the City of New York settled their civil lawsuit for $41 million, an acknowledgement that the system had destroyed 5 innocent lives. But here's where I need to be honest with you about what justice actually looked like in this case. Because the police officers who ran those interrogations, they were never charged. They kept their jobs. They kept their pensions. The prosecutors who stood in a courtroom and argued, with full knowledge that the DNA didn't match, that these 5 boys were guilty, no consequences. And the lead prosecutor, she invented something legal commentators called the unindicted co-ejaculator theory, the idea that Reyes was simply an additional attacker the boys hadn't mentioned. She maintained, even after the exoneration, that the 5 might still be guilty. Confession evidence doesn't just override other evidence. According to psychologist Dr. Saul Kassin of John Jay College, it contaminates all surrounding evidence. Once a confession exists, witnesses change their stories. This is not ancient history. The same interrogation tactics used in 1989 are still legal today. The system that failed these 5 men hasn't been fully fixed, which means it can happen again. The least we can do, the very least, is know their names, know their story, and refuse to look away. Say their names. If this story got under your skin the way it got under mine, hit that like button, because this is the kind of story that needs to be seen. Subscribe if you want more deep dives like this. True crime, real psychology, real consequences. And drop in the comments. Did you know about this case before today? And what do you think should happen to investigators who coerce false confessions? I'll see you in the next one.